Thank you for joining us for another episode of Biblio Files, the program on AADL TV, where each week we take a few minutes to cover one book topic. Today's book topic is your favorite book that takes place in Michigan, has to do with Michigan, is about Michigan. I'm Lucy, and I'm joined as usual by Christopher and Amanda. And then today we have a special guest, Katie, to tell us about her pick. So, Christopher, what book did you pick for Michigan?
Well, I picked Michigan Murders by Edward Keyes. And I'm not really big on true crime. I haven't read many books like that at all. But I did pick this because it's super, super local. It's the Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti area. I also remember my father reading this book a long, long time ago. And despite the fact that it's so grisly, it was kind of interesting to see Ann Arbor places and Ypsilanti places reflected so heavily in a book that you're reading. I don't know how many people have read this book. The murders take place quite a while ago in 1968 and 69. And the book goes through the murders, the investigation, the arrest, and then the trial of the murderer. The book is quite grisly. It's very detailed, and the murders are pretty horrific. Well, the other reason I picked this book is because, Lucy, you mentioned this book in a prior episode, and that was the other connection that made me want to read this. So it has what looks like a lot of recreated dialogue, which is a little bit of a turnoff, but the book does read very quickly. I'm not sure that I want to read any more gore after this, but it is a quick read, and it's part of local infamous history. So that was my pick this time. Katie, do you have something cheerier for us?
A little bit, yeah. The book that I chose is Bud Not Buddy by Christopher Paul Curtis. This is a classic. It has won the Newbery and the Coretta Scott King Award, among many other things. It's a great tale about Bud, who's on the lam. He's trying to find his father, and he starts out in Flint, Michigan, and he journeys throughout the state to get to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the story of all of the adventures that he has and the people that he meets along the way is just delightful. Bud is quite the little character. He's 10 years old in 1936, so it's the middle of the Great Depression, and it's just lovely to hear Bud talk in his own voice. He's a little naive, but he's really optimistic. I love it when he says, uh-oh, like when he knows he's about to be tricked or something fishy is going on. And he's got these Bud Caldwell's rules and things for having a funner life and making a better liar out of yourself. And it's such a wonderful book. I actually was assigned to read this in college, and at the time, I think I must have just flew through it. I didn't really pay much attention to it. I thought it was a lot older book, but this book came out in 1999, which I would have just read it a few years after that when I was assigned it. It showed up on one of our Black Lives Matter lists, and the title came back to me. I remembered this character, and I thought I've got to read it again, and I picked up the audiobook. And I highly recommend listening to the audiobook of this if you haven't. It just really brings Bud even more to life, if you can believe it. But then after I read the audiobook again, I read the print book again because I just loved it so much. So I highly recommend Bud Not Buddy.
Yeah, I think I read that book last summer and I loved it. 5 out of 5 stars. I was reading it for the first time, just fell in love with it. Same thing Katie said, just rave reviews. Bud is amazing. Super recommend. Yeah, loved it. I'm so glad you brought that book to the table today.
Yay, thanks. Me too. What'd you pick, Amanda?
I picked something totally different. I picked a guidebook. I picked the guidebook. This is the book. It is called Belle Isle to 8 Mile, An Insider's Guide to Detroit. And this is the second edition. I also have the first edition. The newest one came out in 2019, and the first one came out in 2012. And the second edition is fully revised and expanded with 500 new entries. And it was put together by 3 siblings who are from the Detroit area. And a couple of them actually own a really cool shop in Detroit in Midtown. It's just a fun guidebook. And for somebody who like grew up in the Metro Detroit area in one of the suburbs, it's just fun to read about the different neighborhoods and some of the history of Detroit. And for a person who lives here, it's different than somebody who's traveling and visiting the city, but it's still fun just to read about like new like bars or restaurants or places to go that you might not have known about. The book is organized by area. So it's got like Midtown, Downtown, Corktown, Upper East Side. And then once you're within that specific, I think there's 12 different regions it lists. And then once you're in there, it breaks it down into different categories, like maybe a typical guidebook would. This one's got planning your visit, lodging, getting around. And then there's a little bit of intro about the history of that specific section of the Detroit. And then there's like shopping services, cultural attractions, entertainment, recreation, points of interest. We've got a little list here I'm looking at. Just really fun. And for me, like flipping through it again to get ready for today, it was just fun to read about the little bits, pieces of some of the history of Detroit and different buildings. And it's got these really cute little illustrations. I can find one. It's all black and white, and there's a lot of text, but it's interspersed with these little illustrations. You probably can't see in here. These little illustrations. So this one's got I think how many 45 new illustrations and 500 new entries versus the first one. It's just a fun book, and it's a way to support like a local family. They've run a shop in Detroit for over a decade, and they're three siblings like that are my age, and so it's just really cool. It's just a fun book if you want to learn about new places in Detroit or places you haven't been to, or just to read about some of like a brief history of some of the different neighborhoods in Detroit. Just a really fun book. Belle Isle to 8 Mile, An Insider's Guide to Detroit. Oh, it's by Andy Lynn, Emily Lynn, and Rob Lynn, 3 siblings. So yeah, that was my pick. Lucy, what did you pick for us?
Before I share my pick, I should just say, Katie, my experience with Bud Not Buddy was a lot like I read it, then I listened to the audiobook, and then I was like, I'm still not ready to be done with Bud, so I had to go back and read it again. Like I just loved that character, loved that book. So yeah, it's just a big smile on my face when you brought that up. Anyway, the book that I picked is called Stealing Buddha's Dinner, and it is a memoir by a woman named Bic Minh Nguyen, and she came to this country from Vietnam when she was 8 months old. So she left Vietnam with her father and her older sister and her grandmother on April 29th, 1975, which was like the last day that helicopters lifted off the roof of the American embassy to get out of Saigon. And they ended up in Arkansas, but then in like a refugee and immigration camp. And then they had an opportunity, they could choose between California or Grand Rapids. And the grandmother had known someone who went to the University of Michigan, so that seemed like symbolic to her. So they came to Grand Rapids. So the book takes place in Grand Rapids, which if you think about it, this is like, so now the mid to late 70s into the 80s. And Grand Rapids at that time was not particularly a hugely diverse community. It was like a lot of Dutch, immigrants, Protestants. So she just feels out of place, but she didn't grow up in Vietnam. So she doesn't have that Vietnamese experience. So for her, what she turns to as like the most American thing is really American food. Her yearning for American food becomes like, that's going to be the normal thing, right? Pringles and Doritos and SpaghettiOs and all those things seem exotic to her. And she just tries to, that's her way of fitting in. Like her lunchbox is embarrassing, but what other kids have. seems really American. And so it seems like the ideal. And she says, like, at home, I kept opening the refrigerator and cupboards, wishing for American foods to magically appear. I wanted what the other kids had: bundt cakes and casseroles, Cheetos and Doritos. The more American foods I ate, the more my desires multiplied. But so it's having grown up like pretty much at exactly the same time she did. I loved hearing about the things that were advertised to her that she wanted to consume, and like the candies that she memorized at the closest gas station, things like Bonkers, which is like a chewy candy that I loved, which they don't even make anymore. And then she also is a huge, there's a lot of references to pop culture at this time. So it goes beyond food into what she was watching on TV, the music she was listening to. So even though I did not grow up in Michigan, and she talks about Grand Rapids a lot, and I think if you know the area, a lot of the landmarks would ring a bell. They didn't for me, but I really felt a lot of familiarity with the things that she was talking about, like the food that was advertised to her that she wanted to get, the music she was listening to, the clothes she wanted to wear. And then the books, the other way she tried to feel American or learn about how to behave was through books. So all the way from like Laura Ingalls Wilder to like the Quimby's, but then to Judy Blume, like that's where she was trying to get her education, her cultural education from. And in fact, this author wrote another book called Pioneer Girl, which is fiction, but it's all about like a journey into where Laura Ingalls Wilder lived. And then an even more local connection is that the author got her MFA at U of M, and she won the Hopwood Award there for poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. So she's very talented. And yeah, it was a great book. And I just loved hearing about really being a child of the 80s, being one myself. So that is Stealing Buddha's Dinner by Bic Minh Nguyen. And yeah, that's my Michigan pick. Does anyone have other final thoughts or anything they want to say about Michigan books?
I'll just say I like the diversity of the choices we had. We had some fiction, some nonfiction, tour guide. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for joining us for another episode of Biblio Files. We will be back next week discussing a book that contains our favorite sentence. So we will see you then. Thanks.